The Spartans knew that when they crossed the borders of Athens, that nothing would happen to them. And so when they went and ravaged the countryside for 40 days, they didn't do a lot of damage, but psychologically, they were essentially saying to Pericles, what are you going to do about it?
You asked, we delivered. This is the Victor Davis Hanson episode. We have heard again and again that you would like to hear from the great Victor Davis Hanson on this episode. I thought that was an excellent idea as well, so I have reached out to Professor Hanson, and he is here to talk with us about the Peloponnesian War, which is the bloodiest conflict in Greek history up to the point that it erupted. There had been nothing quite so protracted and violent and brutal in Greek history before the Peloponnesian War. It effectively ended Athenian dominance in the Aegean and in the Mediterranean, and it is in many ways kind of the sequel to the episode in which we talked all about the Persian Wars and Athens' worries that it would grow overproud and overconfident and would become beaten down by a power that resisted its attempts to go beyond its means. So we are going to talk all about the outbreak of the war with Professor Hanson. We're going to ask him about some of the relevance of the developments described by Thucydides, the historian of the war, to today, especially to relations between the US and China. We're going to cover all of that. But before we get into it, I am going to just bring us up to speed, because last time we sort of were with the ancient Greeks, we were dealing with their victory, their shocking upset victory over Persia in a coalition between a number of Greek city-states that had been threatened by this massive encroaching empire, the Achaemenid Empire. And as the Achaemenids were kind of the latest in the long line of various autocratic expansionist, aggressive empires, Xerxes, son of Darius, decided that it was crucial for him to overtake the Greeks and subjugate them under his sort of ever-expanding sway. And the Greeks, led chiefly by the Athenians and the Spartans, right? So the Spartans in the south of Greece on what's called the Peloponnesus, this little outcropping, and the Athenians to the northeast of them. The kind of first major city that you would hit if you were traveling into Greece from the east is Athens. And these become, in the battle with Persia, they become really the two going concerns in the Greek world. They form an alliance. The Spartans and the Athenians beat back the Persians. We did a whole episode on how all of that worked. And then we kind of said, and after that, there was a period of great Greek flourishing because the Greeks were no longer under threat of annihilation. And that was very exciting for them. And during this period, you have Socrates and the tragedians and all of these guys that we typically kind of think of when we think of Greece. We also kind of hinted that the Greeks themselves knew, Athenians especially themselves knew, what happens to civilizations that get too proud when they have a major victory like this. The Greek words here that are relevant are hubris and nemesis. So hubris is the pride that comes with a sense of never, like you're never going to fail, that your own favor from the gods, your own power, your own wealth is too great for anybody to take you out. And nemesis is, in some tellings, nemesis is kind of the avenging god, or the spirit or the force in the world, which sort of sails in and in a jealous sort of way smacks you down for your pride. And this contributes to the cycle of regimes, which we also talked about, right? This kind of rising and falling of different forms of government. The Athenians were a democracy in the 5th century, and they had a tremendous sense of pride in themselves as a democracy, pride in their form of government, pride in their literary culture and their arts, pride in their military valor. And one of the typical narratives about the Peloponnesian War is that pride turned into hubris, a kind of noble patriotism, eventually became a sense of birthright to rule the entire Aegean, which is the whole sort of sea to the east of Greece, and the Mediterranean as well. So, this sort of expansionist vision. how did all of this happen? Why did Athens turn from a kind of rebel city-state against Persia in league with Sparta to a wannabe empire against Sparta in the Peloponnesian War? Well, the first immediate thing that happens that you need to know about to going into this interview with Victor Davis Hanson is the Delian League. And it's called that sometimes because this is an alliance of city-states. You remember, city-states at this point, independent citywide governments, of which Athens is one. And Athens is making alliances left and right with other city-states, mainly for two purposes. In 478 BC, they form an alliance. And one reason they do this is to sort of stave off further Persian aggression. They think, well, we were united and that's part of how we won, so now we're going to unite again and we'll never be conquered by the Persians. And then the other reason is they want to liberate the Greek East. So there are still city-states that are under Persian control, and with a kind of military alliance and with the navy that they've built up throughout the Persian wars, they're going to be able to fight back more effectively and liberate the rest of Greece. So you can kind of imagine this Delian League expanding. If Athens is on the east, then it's expanding sort of northward and yet further eastward into Greece and its surrounding environments. And then down in the south, you have Sparta, which has had a much longer lived league of its own, the Peloponnesian League, from 550 BC onward. The Spartans have already been in a similar kind of relational coalition. And that kind of extends to the west and the north. And so that they're steadily growing to sort of split the Greek world between the two of them. But in 478 BC, which is when the Delian League, the Athenian League, is founded, it's what's called a sumachia, and this is two Greek words, sum, with, together, and machia, battle, fighting. It's an agreement that all the parties involved are going to fight on one another's behalf when necessary. So if Athens has an ally and the ally is under attack, then Athens will provide both offensive and defensive military aid. So it's fighting with each other together. Again, mostly at this point to resist expansionist aggression from Persia and the East. The number of city-states involved in this league fluctuates from time to time, but it's around 330, most historians say, with their treasury on the island of Delos, which is why they're called the Delian League. Delos is an island in the Cyclades, which is an island in the southern Aegean, and it contains, among other things, the sacred sanctuary of Apollo. So it's a spot that is object of great reverence. It's a place that feels sort of neutral. Islands kind of can feel neutral, and putting the treasury, putting all the money that the league is going to use for its sumachia, for its alliance, on Delos is almost like a gesture of neutrality. It's a gesture of kind of good faith that we are. Athens is not going to be dominant. No one city-state is going to be dominating this whole thing. And that kind of worked for a while. I mean, they did a pretty good job beating back Persia. But one of the things that happened over this intervening period between 478 BC and then the Great Peloponnesian War breaks out in 431 BC. So during that time, one of the things that happens is that the Delian League becomes more and more an Athenian hegemony, right? Hegemony, another Greek word, meaning that the Athenians are kind of the rulers or the leaders in this alliance. And as this continues to build, as it continues to kind of become clear that Athens is the dominant power, Sparta not only begins to take notice, but becomes a little bit concerned. And Thucydides, the great historian of this period, is famous for having said that this was the truest cause of the war, is the Spartan concern about growing Athenian power. And we're going to talk with Professor Hanson about how accurate that is. I believe he has a number of views about sort of other causes for the war. But typically this period is looked at least in part, as this growing era of Athenian expansionism, Athens kind of becoming what it despised, and investing itself in more and more military entanglements that start to worry Sparta. And in fact, they had what's called the First Peloponnesian War sometimes, between 460 and 445 BC, which was basically a prelude to the Big Kahuna, to the real great Peloponnesian War that occurs between 431 and 404 BC. And in the middle, they have kind of a truce or a peace. There are a number of reasons why this happens. First, for one thing, Athens sort of pisses off Sparta by making alliances with its enemies. So at this point, there are no real rules about how these leagues are going to relate to each other. And if Sparta's got an ally and Athens has an interest in fighting that ally, there's nothing that says it can't. But then Athens is kind of invested in a war with like a sort of proxy war almost with Sparta. And so Argos, which was an ancient enemy of Sparta, became an ally of the Athenians. In this period of Athenian expansion, one of the things that Athens is doing is it's installing almost like Athenian patsy governments, which are democracies, but they're kind of, I mean, it's been compared sometimes to the American policy of installing democracies, or attempts to install democracies in the Middle East, which I hope we'll talk about with Dr. Hanson as well. But this idea that if you set up some like kind of a mini version of yourself in a city-state, then you have allied that city-state with yourself. And there are a bunch of revolutions during this time because many of these governments that Athens is installing are kind of patsy governments and they're not actually reflective of the true will of those and the needs of those city-states. So Athens is installing in places like Megara these sort of pro-Athenian governments. And the major point here is that this Athenian rise to power is giving is getting on Sparta's nerves and stepping on Sparta's toes, right? At the same time, Athens is fighting in Egypt against Persian control, so they sort of send aid to this Egyptian uprising against Persia, and that also fails. So that sort of makes Athens a little bit more on edge. And one of the things they do is they move the treasury from Delos, this sort of neutral central space, into Athens. And instead of becoming this sort of general Symmachia, the Delian League, again, becomes more and more this kind of Athenian-led project. And the use of those resources to fight against other Greek city-states was unprecedented and a change in the dynamics in this region, right? And so this is a kind of unsustainable situation, and the light is really the match is really lit in 447 when Boeotia revolts, and this is an Athenian sort of ally, but Athens at this point is kind of worried about its empire steadily crumbling, essentially. So they send a general Tolmides to fight back against this Boeotian revolt, but he loses the Battle of Coronea, it's called. Euboea and Megara both revolt, so these two more Athenian allies that are kind of breaking away. And eventually Sparta, fed up with this Athenian aggression, invades. And this is the point at which kind of it becomes clear that this is an unsustainable situation. So remember, this is still the First Peloponnesian War. Pericles, a famous general during this time, and is fabulously well-connected, hugely popular, at least initially popular, statesman, negotiates a truce with Sparta, with the Spartan general Pleistoanax. And in the winter of 446 to 45, they established the 30 Years' Peace, which is kind of the truce, basically, between Sparta and Athens that so there are a number of terms, actually, of this peace. One is that, each major power will effectively be responsible for its own allies. Both leagues are legitimate, and the allies, no major power will aid another major power's allies in revolution or what have you. But any polis, any Greek city-state that's neutral can join either side. So, and then finally, the sort of one of the most important terms is that if it looks like there's going to be war, but even one side wants peace, then they're going to have an arbiter who basically settles it for them. So hypothetically, this prevents the outbreak of war. And it's called the 30 Years' Peace. It lasts from 445 until 431. So that tells you it is not a 30 Years' Peace, and it's tested sort of periodically throughout this time. And we're leading up here now to the period about which we're going to talk with Dr. Hanson. Well, the first thing that happens is that Samos, which is an island in the east, rebels. And Samos is an Athenian property, Athenian ally, and they're aided in their revolution by the Persian satrap Pisothunes. Pisothunes is this sort of Persian power that sort of helps out Samian. This is like this danger, Will Robinson, right? Because if Sparta starts to aid, or rather, if Persia starts to aid uprisings of Athenian territories against Athens, then they all go, basically. Then that's like a domino effect. But Sparta decides not to go to war, not to break the peace in the Samian rebellion. Corinth, notably, right, the other kind of major power and the Spartan ally, Corinth argues against it, which is important. And the peace is not broken. So we still have sort of breathe a sigh of relief. But what happens next is really kind of the spark that triggers the powder keg. And once I've explained this, we'll kind of leap into discussing this whole period with Victor Davis Hanson. Corcyra was a colony of Corinth. So remember Corinth, the kind of third major power, Spartan ally. But Corcyra and Corinth did not have good relationships. At this point, if you founded a colony, the colony kind of could become its own independent interest and could have its own interests against its mother colony. And Corcyra and Corinth were not on good terms. Corcyra, it had its own colony, the colony of Epidamnus. So this is like a colony of a colony, right? And the Corcyrians are faced with one of these revolutions of their own, because Epidamnus stages a revolt in which the democratic faction overthrows the aristocratic faction. The aristocrats kind of fight back, and long story short, essentially what happens is that the Corcyrians first appeal to Corinth, their mother city, for help, but that doesn't work. They kind of get shoved off. And then they go instead to Athens, and they ask Athens to be involved with this. And so now you have kind of a real testing of the 30 Years' Peace, because if Athens helps Corcyra, then they're not aiding a revolution against Sparta. Corcyra is not a Spartan ally. But Corinth is a Spartan ally, and Corcyra and Corinth are now openly at war. And so the Corcyrians basically say, look, you can do this. It's not a break of the peace. The Corinthians say, you might as well be breaking the peace, basically. Pericles looks at this and he says, I'm going to adopt a policy of deterrence. And we'll talk also about that with Professor Hansen. That I'm going to send sort of a small fleet, because if Corinth wins in this sort of fight with Corcyra, then it's going to Corinth will subsume its fleet, and we'll have basically a fleet that rivals Athenian dominance of the sea, and that cannot be borne. This kind of seemingly minor squabble, and another one that follows in Potidaea, which is another sort of a similar kind of squabble between allies of these two states, is the spark that lights the powder keg, and everything explodes. We're going to talk in a second with Professor Hansen about just like how bad this war was, but man, it was really bad. Before we switch over to talk with Victor Davis Hanson about some of the issues that were at stake here, let me thank you once again so much for listening to this podcast, or watching it if you're watching it. Please pause for a moment and give us a 5-star review, or subscribe if you haven't already. We love to read the 5-star reviews, and most importantly, your subscriptions and your sort of sharing the word is sort of how we get the word out about this podcast. Plus, you'll be able to get all of our new episodes. All right. Thanks again for listening. Here is my conversation with Victor Davis Hanson. Here on Young Heretics, we're extremely excited today. We have another honorary heretic, as we like to say, a guest. And this is our most requested guest ever. I've heard repeatedly that people would love to hear from Professor Victor Davis Hanson, and he's agreed to come on today and speak to us. So he probably needs no introduction, would be my guess, but I will just say, of course, he's a tremendously celebrated scholar of the ancient world and of military history. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, And he's published extremely widely on a number of topics, both ancient and modern, to do with military history and tactics. In particular, today we're here to talk with him about the Peloponnesian War, which is a famous conflict near the end of what we would consider kind of the high classical period, or really throughout the 5th century, but at the end, up to the end of the 5th century, between Athens, the Athenians and their allies, and Sparta and its allies. Professor Hanson has written on this war extensively. His book, A War Like No Other, which came out in 2005, was very popular on this subject. And I've called him here today specifically to kind of go over with us the outbreak of this really cataclysmic conflict in the Greek world. Thucydides, the historian of this period and this war, the sort of great historian, writes near the end of the 5th century BC, famously wrote of this conflict that, although many people had tried to sort of figure out why war broke out between Athens and Sparta, in his view, the truest cause was that Sparta was growing afraid of increasing Athenian power. The Delian League was increasingly led by Sparta as a hegemony, and the tensions that built between these two, as it were, great powers in the Aegean and in Greece, were what led almost, some have said, inevitably to a war. But Professor Hanson, before I leap in with you, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Could you speak a little bit about this so-called truest cause of Thucydides? Tell us a little bit about, in your opinion, just why is it that war broke out between these two powers that had previously had friendly relations? They'd wanted to have a peace. And is it your view that this was an inevitable conflict, or do you think that this is something that could have been avoided?
It's a very difficult subject. I had a professor at Stanford in 1970, Lionel Pearson, who wrote about this in a seminal article called Prophasis, the Pretext, and Itea. And that binary appears throughout Thucydides, where he'll say, these are the things people allege, or these are the things that were ostensibly the cause, but the truest cause, and he uses the superlative of altheia, the noun in the adjectival form, was the real cause. But it's very hard to adjudicate that because sometimes his analysis is belied by the data. So what do I mean in the case of his statement that the truest cause was the growing power of Athens and the fear that it incurred among Spartans? It means that there were other data points or other evidentiary items that he put into the history, and then he sort of neglected them and said, but you know what? The real cause was they were just afraid. But then when you look at the actual history, they had gone to war earlier in the 450s, 16 years. And at that point, Athens was not as powerful as it was in 431. And the reason that they went to war earlier were ongoing disputes about the hegemony or the control of the Greek world. That would be the truest cause in that case. But the problem I have with that determinist explanation is there were so many antitheses. Athens was a sea power incapable of harming the Spartan hoplite army, and vice versa. The hoplites of Sparta couldn't do much with the navy of Athens. Athens was a chattel slavery society. Sparta was based on a uniquely kind of bizarre system of heritage, in between slavery and freedom, maybe something like serfdom. Athens was a cosmopolitan seaport. Sparta prided itself on being a conservative, traditional inland power. Sparta was Doric, Athens was Ionic. Sparta was oligarchic, Athens, we could go on and on. So there were enough existential differences that made them natural enemies, and their alliance during the common threat of the Persian invasion of 490 and then 480 and 479, upon analysis, it was a very, very shaky alliance. The Spartans did not show up at Marathon. They really didn't have a very large, or could they have a large contingent at Salamis. There was arguments over whether the Dorian spear at Plataea or the wooden walls at Salamis should be given the credit. And so they were always prone to go to war. And Thucydides makes that pretty clear, but then he says in 431, the straw that broke the camel's back was the fear that if Sparta did not preempt and invade the territory of Attica, which they had done earlier in the First Peloponnesian War, then the future would not be kind to Sparta. I'm kind of skeptical of that. I'm not sure Thucydides himself believed it because he gave so many other reasons in addition that were not so deterministic. They were just factual and existential.
Well, there are personalities involved as well in this story, and sometimes I wonder whether in this kind of systematic view, Thucydides has sometimes been interpreted as offering a kind of great powers view of history, that it operates according to, just systems of interaction between these powers. The antitheses that you lay out are very kind of top level and deep historical antitheses. To what extent do you think that, for example, Pericles' role in the 30 Years Peace that you mentioned, Pericles' role in some of the scuffles and the tensions that led up to the outbreak of war in 431, and just his general attitude about, do you think, view Athens and Sparta in this way, and did it matter that he had that, what his view was at all?
Well, I think in many ways, as the inheritor of Themistoclean strategy of building walls and making Athens, which didn't necessarily happen, but primarily a radical democracy that championed the thetes or the property-less class over the hoplite landowners who were vulnerable out in the countryside, and the long walls to the Piraeus that institutionalized that dichotomy, as well as the building of the fleet that empowered the lower classes with wages. They didn't have to bring their own armor to serve. And then the creation of this huge empire in the Aegean, the transmogrification of the Delian League into the Athenian empire, all of that was the creation of Pericles, the great building program on the Acropolis, the Propylaea, the Parthenon, later the Erechtheum. And it was his view that Athens, as Thucydides puts words in his mouth in the funeral oration, almost had a birthright or a predestination to rule Greece because of its system of transparency and open society, democratic institutions, and these he felt were innately superior. And the tragedy of Pericles in 431 was he felt that if they did not reply to the aggression against their allies, the Corcyraeans at Corfu versus the Corinthian Spartan allies, or if they were not preactive or proactive at Epidamus, Potidaea, Megara, all of these hotspots, then they would be considered weak and they would lose deterrence. So he was an advocate of an active policy that would confront what he felt was Spartan aggression. It's very hard to find out where Spartan aggression is, however. And then when you read the funeral oration, you can see that he's embittered because of the plague and the change after the plague. He's embittered. We have a very nice juxtaposition of the funeral oration and then the plague, and then his, you like me when things were going good, now you blame me and it's your fault, not mine. But my point is that he's very unapologetic. He has confidence in Athens. And my point finally is that the strategy of going into the walls of Athens, Pericles' strategy that was a modification of Themistocles' strategy of abandoning the countryside in 480. The problem with it was not just that it created a huge urban density as, 100,000, 150,000 people in the countryside came into the city, and we had this plague, whatever it was, typhus, typhoid, we don't know. But it was a policy of rope-a-dope, laxity. It did not maintain deterrence. So the Spartans knew that when they crossed the borders of Athens, that nothing would happen to them. And so when they went and ravaged the countryside for 40 days, they didn't do a lot of damage, but psychologically, they were essentially saying to Pericles, what are you going to do about it? And his answer was, nothing. We'll have seaborne raids around the periphery of the Peloponnese. And it took them a long time to develop an offensive strategy after his death. And the tragedy of the Athenians was they finally got it right. They understood that you have to go down into the Peloponnese, as they did during the Peace of Nicias at the Battle of Mantinea, and physically defeat the Spartan army and its allies, and then liberate cities around Sparta. That failed at the Battle of Mantinea for a want, I think, of Athenian support. And then you have to start freeing the Helots as they tried to at Pylos. And then, in addition, you have to humiliate the Spartans in a pitched battle somewhere in Greece. And all of that was picked up 50 years later by the great Theban liberator Epaminondas. And he understood the Athenians had been on the right track, but they lacked the resources. So he did go down to the Peloponnese like the Athenians did, but he won. He created the great fortified bastions of democracy at Messene, Megalopolis, Mantinea. He freed the Helots of Messenia, and he essentially rendered Sparta into a non-player in the Greek city-states after 370 BC. But it was a interpretation that the Athenians had not followed through a strategy that might have worked.
This conflict to which you allude in Epidamnus, which has to do with a revolt that essentially, it looks sometimes from the outside like kind of the spark that lit the powder keg, or this match lit in a room full of dry powder. Because of course, then you have the Corcyraeans, who are in some sense a kind of offshoot of Corinth, but in tension with them, and that triggers again this much vaster conflict, which you described very eloquently. It's my impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the brutality of the tactics that you are describing was sort of unprecedented. I mean, you've written compellingly about how violent and devastating this war was, and how those intimidation tactics sort of escalated over time. In addition to the plague, which was already in itself just a catastrophe and a really gruesome event. There was just a kind of viciousness in this conflict that, as I understand it, had not previously been the sort of going practice in Greek warfare. Can you tell me whether I'm right about that? And if so, why do you think that was?
Well, most warfare, not all, but most warfare prior to the Peloponnesian War were domestic disputes between city-states, and they were typically over borderland or disputed territory. They were decided by a hoplite battle. We don't want to call them formal rules, but there was an element of ritual within hoplite battle, and we know the casualties were somewhere around 15% of the winner and 5% of the loser. Steep casualties, but not steep if they were not frequent. And we don't have a lot of names, maybe 30 or 40 of them in the 5th century. But the problem with the Peloponnesian War was that the essential problem was that the strengths of Athens and the strengths of Sparta, what the military calls an elephant and a whale, were not compatible. So you were going to have Athens doing one thing and Sparta doing the other, and they were not going to come to resolution. So we only had 2 hoplite battles of any size at Delium and Mantinea. We had one at Syracuse and at Olpae, but mostly we got out of that paradigm. And in that vacuum, people engaged in light arm raiding, seaborne raids, mass execution at Melos or at Mytilene, and various ways to defeat the enemy in lieu of the fact that the war will not be over until Sparta creates a fleet that destroys the Athenian ability to control its subjects and import food. And Athens cannot win that war until it gets enough allies to create the type of army that Epaminondas did later, 70, 80,000 men, and go down in the Peloponnese and physically rob Sparta of its Peloponnese, and that will end the war. And the irony of the tragedy is that the supposedly blinkered and isolationist traditional Spartans were the more innovative, in that they enlisted the Persians, got the capital, and after the tragedy at Syracuse, they were able to create a huge fleet with Persian money, and then allies like the people from Corinth, the Thebans, the Syracusans. They had a huge alliance, and they beat Athens at its game before Athens could beat Sparta at it. But the violence increased because of that and the fact that it was a 27-and-a-half-year-long war. So each year the frustration grew that they needed to be a little bit more savage, a little bit tougher, and a little bit less merciful, and maybe that would add the missing ingredient to victory. And that happens throughout war. The longer the war, the more vicious it becomes.
What's interesting to me about the analysis you're presenting here is that at several points you seem to be challenging the kind of classic view, and I say that in a colloquial way, the classic view of the Spartans, that over time in history, and also I think at the time among the Athenians, Spartans viewed as a sort of fantastically aggressive, tremendously militaristic people. You call them blinkered, that they're supposed to have kind of not been slow to change. But in fact, as you indicate, it's really a Periclean policy of deterrence that sort of preempts Spartan aggression that may or may not have been forthcoming. And in the end, it's the Spartans, again, who sort of adapt to the changing circumstances. Do you think that the Spartans in this war have kind of like been the victims of a misrepresentation that's sort of due to our Athenocentric, the fact that a lot of our sources come from Athens? Why is it do you think that the Spartans are constantly thwarting our expectations of them here in this story?
The thing about the Spartans are that for the able-bodied men that are free citizens, and we don't know how many there are, perhaps 10 or 15,000 full hoplites, and then we have the periorchy, the modified citizenry. They might have had 30,000, but within that body politic, they had a very stable tripartite government. In fact, it was a precursor, along with Crete, of what we saw at Rome. They had a Gerousia, an upper chamber, as it were. It had a ecclesia of every male as a lower chamber of the legislative branch. It had ephors that were in some sense judicial, and then as a foretaste of the two consuls at Rome, it had two kings. So it had an executive, legislative, and judicial system. So it was very stable over time as long as it didn't overreach. And by that I mean send people abroad in imperialistic, expeditionary agendas, as we saw in the 4th century with Agesilaus. Then it starts to break down. But during the Peloponnesian War, that system of government was pretty stable. But more importantly, there were, at key points in Spartan history, these, I don't know what we would call them, outliers, George Patton-like, Curtis LeMay, William Tecumseh, crazy people. They weren't full. Sometimes they were bastards, Nothoi. Sometimes they were of questionable lineage. Sometimes they were scoundrels. But I'm talking specifically about Brasidas and his use of enfranchised and current helots, light armed troops. And he understood you could go up to key points like Amphipolis and wound the Athenian Empire without directly invading Attica. Very successful. Or Gylippus, the genius who came in with a fleet of Corinthian ships and really reversed the entire course of the Sicilian expedition to Athens' detriment. Or perhaps the best was the maverick, or I don't know what we would call him, outlier Lysander, who in the last 5 years of the war took control of the combined Peloponnesian fleet. And he understood that if you destroyed the Athenian fleet, and you had to destroy it, and you had an expeditionary army in Athens under King Aegeus, then Athens could not continue the war. So those three people are a good example of Spartan rigidity, but also flexibility to allow people that weren't really traditional Spartiates to use a type of imagination and vision that was every bit as good as any Athenian commander. If you look at Brasidas, Gylippus, and Lysander, and you compare them to the best Athenian commanders, whether that was Alcibiades or Demosthenes, they tend to be as good or better. And that's not what we expect from Sparta.
Indeed. And when you describe their regime form, it's an important reminder, because I think typically people tend to focus on Athens as so-called birthplace of democracy, and that there's a lot of focus on their sort of regime progress, but not as much on Sparta. In many ways, and often this sort of the catastrophe that Athens underwent is sometimes looked upon as a kind of parable about what the Greeks called hubris, and you have written to some extent about this yourself, of course. I'd I'm wondering whether you think there's truth to that interpretation. I mean, the Greeks themselves had, of course, the Athenians themselves had a sort of set of ideas about how hubris could set in after a great triumph and in successful societies. Is that a factor here as well?
I think it is. That was the view, I think, of a lot of contemporaries. After the plague, remember, there's a cult of Asclepius that's moved it to the Acropolis, and there was a view, and in Sophocles' Oedipus, we see a plague coming, and Oedipus is guilty of hubris that incurs nemesis and ate destruction. So there, in Sophocles' later plays during the Peloponnesian War, and in Euripides' early plays, and then there's a taste of that in Aristophanes' 11 comedies, you get the impression that the Athenians themselves felt that something had gone terribly wrong. And in the mind of Thucydides, he's always adverse to simplistic explanations, but he felt that the plague and the Sicilian expedition, those two disasters, had more or less ensured that Athens, while they might not lose the war, they couldn't win the war after that. They lost about 80,000 people to the plague and 40,000 Athenians and allies on Sicily. And both of them, in some sense, were due to bad planning, bad strategy, and overconfidence, and then they won a divine retribution. Thucydides doesn't believe in divine retribution necessarily, but many of his contemporaries, especially the playwrights, do, and it's all over Sophocles. That's a theme of Sophoclean tragedy, especially his later plays. So I think they thought that at their highest moment of power, they had fallen to the wages of affluence, leisure, arrogance, and there was a comeuppance that was going to be natural. Plutarch, in some of the lives of the 5th century Athenians, he has anecdotes of little boys drawing pictures of Carthage in the sand, that after they went to Sicily, then they were going to go over to Carthage and they were going to create a Western pan-Mediterranean empire, which would, after the plague and why they were fighting Sparta. And Thucydides, as typical, when he chronicles all of the disasters, he does say that he has a lot of admiration for democracy because of all the systems of government. In extremis, it's the most flexible to recover quickly. And after the disasters at Sicily, when everybody thought they were going to implode, they did not, because they came together, they galvanized. And then he makes some extraordinary statements that they basically were not fighting the Spartans anymore. They were fighting the Spartans, the Thebans, the Syracusans, and Persian money all at once. And so he thinks that it's their own fault that they incurred so many enemies at such a time, and that they were not willing to negotiate. That theme is taken up by Xenophon with the Battle of Arginusae. But nevertheless, he's amazed at their resilience and the resources that they brought to the war.
It's fascinating. You're reminding me of a wonderful essay by Bernard Knox about Euripides called "The Poet as Prophet," which speaks to some of the themes you've evoked there in the development of tragedy and drama more generally. I think also we've spoken previously on this podcast about Aeschylus and the Persians, especially, which is in some ways kind of lays the groundwork for this poetic understanding of the cycle of regimes, and of course that will be enshrined in.
Yeah, a lot of people made that point, that the irony was that Athens was playing the role of the Persians, even though they understood the wages of hubris and nemesis, and that Aeschylus at least had thought, in at least two of his plays, that when nations or people act like that, then they deserve what they get, and it's inevitable. And yet Athens goes from a small defender without adequate resources that wins brilliantly at Salamis and later at Plataea, and then it sort of flips over and plays the roles of an overdog. And the Greeks themselves were quite aware of that. One of the ironies of Greek history is that of all of the historians, the most anthropological is Herodotus. And in some ways, that's another topic, but he can be more empirical than Thucydides because he doesn't have an overall theme other than hubris incurs nemesis. He's not interested in a lot of the issues that Thucydides is, who tends to pick and select events of the Peloponnesian War and magnify or lessen their importance within his text to highlight the philosophical point he's making, whereas in Herodotus, he more or less describes a series of events, and he's empirical. And as somebody who grew up in Asia Minor at Halicarnassus, I think he's much more sympathetic to Persia, and he understands they're arrogant, they're different, but he seeks to understand how they work, and he has some sympathy for them, as did Xenophon. So the Greeks were not chauvinist or ethnocentric in the way that they're sometimes portrayed.
Indeed. In the time that remains to us, I'd like to just turn our attention a little bit to more recent history, because you have written very eloquently on sort of attempts, successful and unsuccessful attempts, to analogize what happened in the Peloponnesian War, and analogize specifically Thucydides' account of it with various 20th and 21st century conflicts. So the big kind of hot button version of this, I would say right now, is this notion of the Thucydides trap, that somehow the US and China, as an established and an ascendant great power, are cartwheeling inevitably toward this same form of kind of, there's no way out of this but war, essentially. It seems to me that the views you've articulated today would push against the inevitability of that account. But on the other hand, maybe you think there's truth to that. I'd just love to hear what you think about it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an ancient and a contemporary example model that would argue against the Thucydides trap. And the ancient, of course, as I said earlier, there were multifarious reasons, political, economic, social, issues between Athens and Sparta, which Greeks at the time felt were existential and could cause a war. But they didn't necessarily have to cause a war. The First Peloponnesian War was resolved without the carnage of the Second. And so that 50-year period from the end of the Persian Wars, the Pentacontinentia, to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War was manageable, even though they had quite antithetical systems, and each system had a host of allies, so much like the Cold War between 1946 and 1989. And yet that system, to take the modern example, was manageable, even though we had nuclear weapons. There were certain issues and doctrines and protocols that, even if they were informally communicated, were understood by the Kremlin and the Pentagon and the White House, that you did not let a modern version of Epidamnus or Potidaea or Megara involve nuclear weapons. And so whether it was Korea or Vietnam or Cuba, there was a way to resolve that. Sometimes it was not a sure thing. And so what I'm getting at is that when we look at this modern Thucydides trap, and it's usually often cited for the growing rivalry between China and us, people feel that an established power might then feel that the future in a determinist fashion was not favorable or conducive to it. And so China has 1.4 billion people, we have 330 million. They have a very efficient communist party. The complaint against us is what we see today, chaos in the streets. China is producing far more STEM engineers than we are, et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of cultural pessimism suggests that China, according to the Communist Party's own proclamations, they will be the world hegemon. The Silk Road Initiative, all of that stuff is going to overwhelm us in 15 or 20 years, and that might force us to preempt in the way that the truest cause of our differences is a fear of rising Chinese power. I think it's not applicable because 500 million Chinese have never seen a Western doctor. They have enormous environmental problems. We have 7,500 nuclear weapons, probably 3,000 are deployable. We have 12 aircraft carriers. We have the largest economy in the world. China has 3 times the number of workers that we do, and it produces about 70% of the GDP. We forget that one American worker is more efficient than 3 Chinese workers. And they have a rendezvous with a lot of things that we've already dealt with, from environmental damage to class and tensions. And they've got a lot of problems coming. They've severely injured their brand with the COVID-19 crisis. A lot of people in Europe, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea are looking for leadership at sort of a resurrection of the containment policy. So I'm not sure that the United States would preempt, and I'm not sure that China would preempt. I know China wouldn't, because for them to preempt, they would lose. And I think the United States feels that they can contain China through allies, missile defense, and a nuclear deterrent.
To me, the value in what you're saying is, in part, at least, that it puts a value on studying history and military history specifically. I mean, to view these forces as kind of inexorable determinist forces is really to take a kind of Marxian view, which makes the study of history purely into a way of reading the tea leaves and seeing what's coming in the future. But if what you're saying is true, as I believe it is, there's a way to take some of the tactical errors that you're describing in the Peloponnesian War and use them as cautionary tales to understand our situation going forward.
I think the determinist view, the Hegelian view of history is on an arc to a predetermined finishing point, was very popular in the 80s and 90s, especially with an article in a book by Francis Fukuyama, that consumer, capitalist, consensual government was the only system that worked, and whether we liked it or not, we were all headed in that direction. And at the time he wrote that, we had the greatest number of democracies in the history of the world. Why there was some truth to it, I think that what happened after that, 9/11, the rise of radical Islam, the loss of democracy in very many places, the tragedy of the post-Soviet Union, which did not turn out to be, as people said it would be, constitutional, the idea that Tiananmen Square would inevitably lead to Chinese democracy, especially if the corporate world and the United States government and its appendages were to treat China with magnanimity, bring it into this family of nations, bring its students over, acculturate it to the West, they would be impressed. In fact, they looked at that outreach as magnanimity to be dealt with as weakness, deserving of contempt rather than aid deserving of gratitude. And so all we did was we gave them certain Western elements that enhanced their economic, their educational, and their military systems, but they picked and chose. And one thing they did not want was our system of cultural, economic, political, constitutional government. They just didn't want it. And they feel they made a wise choice. I don't think they did, but they feel they did. But the point is that it's not determined by some. Barack Obama was very eager to say the arc of history bends toward the moral good. History is cyclical, and there are certain events in the past that replicate each other, and we can look back, and if we make the necessary adjustment, we can see that they're valuable. But none of them, ipso facto, will be deterministic on what we do. They're just there as reference point. And the historian's job is not to prejudice his selection of each of these examples, but to use them in a way that's conducive to making a current analysis. But history doesn't repeat itself, but it follows earlier guidelines, and then it comes to slightly different results.
You're alluding here, I believe, to Fukuyama's notion of the end of history, which, as you say, proved to be a sort of a misunderstanding of how things work. I think in many cases, as you indicate, the forces at play are much more ancient and primal than we tend to assume. We sort of tend to assume that we sort of moved past some of the dynamics that might figure into a Thucydidean analysis or an ancient analysis. And of course, that seems not to be the case. You also remind me a little bit of, Tom Holland has come out just not too long ago with this book, Dominion, in which he notes that our sort of easy assumption that the values which we hold are not only self-evident to us, but to a whole range of other societies that have not been trained in them is, that's an assumption that has not really held good, in many cases to the detriment of others. But Professor Hanson, it's been such a pleasure and enriching conversation. You have enriched this podcast by coming on, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, he was awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I thought that was a really fascinating interview, and particularly helpful near the end there about how to read history. I think we've talked a fair bit on this show about good and bad ways to use historical data to understand the present moment. Like, some bad ways include like trying to judge everything by the standards of the present, right? Trying to imagine that history just repeats itself exactly. Dr. Hansen was talking about that, as a kind of overly simplistic view. And then I think we on this show have been trying more to identify certain dynamics that do recur, right? So we've talked a lot about the fall of the Roman Republic as a sort of recurring, as containing dynamics which are currently recurring in our American Republic. We've talked about the sort of trend toward demagoguery and the reasons why demagoguery emerges. Like, that kind of thing helps to understand in the way that Professor Hanson was talking about, sort of helps to understand in a more nuanced way, just like, what can we take from this? Because if you have just a purely determinist idea about, well, this cause leads to this cause, leads to this cause, and that determinist idea can arise, I think, from readings of Thucydides that are too literal, right? That are not sophisticated enough. That idea just sort of it leaves you with a history you can't do anything with, because whatever forces are at play are the forces that are at play. But in fact, as we noted in that interview, right, there are personalities. Pericles is a very forceful personality. He named a number of sort of Spartan kind of renegades that not only have contributed to our perception of Sparta in this period, but just more generally kind of directed the course of the war. And all of that sort of speaks to our present conflicts with China, right? Because there are those who have argued that we're just hurtling inevitably toward a war with China, that America is doomed to succumb to China. But the sort of more hopeful note that Professor Hanson struck there at the end is, I think, much more correct. Anyway, really glad he came on. Thank you guys for asking for it, and thanks to him for doing it. We are going to switch now to the mailbag. Here is a mailbag question that I have gotten numerous times now, and I wanted to spend some time thinking about how to answer it, because it's an important question and a really valuable question. A lot of folks see that on Twitter and in the world, I am a very religious person. Specifically, I'm a Christian. I believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and I sort of some might say I'm a Jesus freak, and that like I do a lot of like calls to prayer on Twitter and all that stuff. And often people will say, like, that seems great. That's really great that you have faith. I wish that I had faith because I have this kind of anxiety in my life. I'm miserable in this way or whatever. But I just can't believe, like, usually because I either don't feel God's presence here in my heart, or I don't think it's rational to believe. I can't think my way to right belief. And, I get that. I really get the rationality concern, because I think there's so much messaging out there that faith is irrational, that you can't be smart and reasonable and believe in anything supernatural, let alone God, anything beyond just the material. And I think that's really wrong. I think if you examine it more closely, you'll find that even good scientists can't believe that there's only matter in the world, and that the older way of understanding the world, that it contains both physical and metaphysical elements, is actually much more sophisticated. We'll do episodes on this on the show, but really, if I sat here with you and argued out why it's rational to believe in God, why you must believe in God, it wouldn't fix the other problem, right? It wouldn't fix the I can't feel it in my heart problem, because you don't feel things in your heart by thinking about them. That's kind of the obvious point, but it sometimes is neglected. There are people who think their way to faith, who sort of reason themselves out of their doubts. But more often than not, the real kind of hang up is more emotional. And even the rationality hang up is kind of emotional. It's kind of like, I see a lot of smart people who say there's no reason to believe in God. And that hang up kicks in where you're like, this just doesn't, I can't plunk for this. Here is my advice if you are in this position. Give God a trial run. God offers like unlimited free trials, right? They are not limited to 60 days. Although I do suggest that you put a limit on this period to check in with yourself, because here's the thing. You actually believe in all sorts of things already that you don't have direct experience of. You believe probably in the existence of atoms. You believe in quantum mechanics. You believe in relativity theory. All of this stuff that has become commonplace in our sort of scientific understanding, and that we have built our great machines on, right? We know that these things exist, that these advanced scientific theories are true, not because we understand how they work or have thought through and accepted and persuaded of the rationale for them, but because their effects are visible in our lives. Because I have a computer, and when I tell the computer to do what I want it to do, it works. And when I'm told by people who know more about this than I do that that's because of, the interaction of electrons and so forth, I believe them, even though I've never seen an electron and I basically only remember what I learned in like 11th grade chemistry, right? So you can do this with God too. You don't actually have to reason your way to feeling the presence of God, and probably you can't. Like that's not a reasonable way. We don't treat any other sphere of human knowledge that way. So instead, like, just go talk to the guy. Like my dad always says, his lines are open, right? And you can do this. Like, I believe that God, as the God of truth, like wants to know exactly what's on your mind, and so like you should feel free to just say like, "Hi God, I don't really believe in you, but I wish I did. And here are like the concerns on my heart. Here are some of the things that I feel, here are some of the ways that I feel like I have failed." That's kind of a major route to prayer, and that I need forgiveness for. And here are some of the like deepest desires and aspirations of my heart. Like, please, would you like help me with that? And not only do I believe that God is real and therefore is there and will answer your prayers, but I think that you, by acting as if God were real, will come to experience his actions in your life and understand it from the inside out. People will tell you that this is kind of like brainwashing or indoctrination, but they're wrong. That's not what this is at all. This is the exact same way that you came to know about electrons, just by hearing smart people. I hope that I am a smart person who can tell you like it's not irrational to believe in God, and we'll talk more about it. But like, smart people tell you that these things can exist. You act in the world as if they do exist, and observe how your life changes. If it changes in a way that makes more sense, if it starts to work better with God than without, as I believe it will, then plunk for it. And the Christians say taste and see, right? There's a direct experiential part of this that you can't be argued into, and you have to just like plunge in and see what happens. That's my advice. You lose nothing by taking it, right? You're not actually gonna. It doesn't cost you anything. God will not be mad at you if you like enter into this kind of provisional relationship with him. And the worst thing that can happen is things stay the same. So give it a shot. All right. That's the mailbag. Thanks for listening to this episode of Young Heretics. It's been a joy as always. If you like what we do here, you should check out the Claremont Institute where I work, because you will love what they do there and what we do there at the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. You can also, please do donate to us at claremont.org/donate and let them know that we sent you from Young Heretics. That's it for this week. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.